Okay, today I'm going to talk about the bar pendants that I make using earring sets. Now, these bar pendants are a single piece bar with a bail on each side, but also a third hidden bail in the back. And this bail basically keeps the pendant in front of the chain instead of having the chain cut across the top here, and that allows you to create these nice kind of V shapes. And with the earring pairs, there's two types that you see most often, or at least I do, and that is these kind of teardrop to match pear shaped, and then there is these kind of long thin triangles that I'm throwing around here. And I'm going to take these long thin triangles and I'm going to make a pendant today. But I have two out here right now to show you. Just this one is done with the rounded pear shapes and the other one is done with the triangles. So it's not so much a single pendant as it is a style that you can create, but they all have the similarities, the way that these bails are created and held, the way that I latch the stones into the pendant. So hopefully I'll be able to show you how to make one on your own. So this is the pair that I'm working with, and this pair actually, when you set them together, you notice that they don't have a completely straight top up here. And I actually prefer the ones that don't have a straight top for this because it allows you to kind of mess with this angle right here to get a nice triangle here. And when I'm starting, what I usually do is I lay them out, I get an angle that I kind of like, and I start messing with my third stones and placing them in and trying to get an idea kind of how this pendant would look. Do I want to do it with this piece of ammonite? Or I also have a long thin citrine that matches that I'm messing with, and I will kind of curl it around, see what sort of angles I can get until I find something that I'm pretty happy with. And after messing around for a while, I've been kind of happy with this design, so I think this is what I'm going to go with. The carnelian matches really well with these orangey umbers over here, so this is going to be where I start. And when I start with 16 gauge round as my frame, and I generally start kind of right in here where one of these meet, and I'm going to come, let me see if I can find a better pointer. All right, here we go, nice little pointer. I'm going to start right in here, and I'm going to follow this up, around, down, behind this main stone, up, around, and down again. So we're going to kind of create this shape for the frame. This runs that up, around, and down, and this is where I've connected, and the same thing up, around, and down, and this one is connected right here. And then right here in the center, we've tied it together to hold the frame sturdy. So that's going to be the basis of this entire pendant. So one of the things that you can do is use a sheet of paper, and you're going to place these items on here the way that you want your pendant to be set up, and you're kind of going to do a bit of an outline here. Now, when doing this, you can take something straight and kind of press it here because you want those tips to be aligned. Because if you've got one really high up and then the other one there, you're going to end up with a lopsided pendant. So I tend to kind of use something straight, lay it down there, and then wing them down from that so that their points are exact. And then I'll straighten this guy. And then I like to, you want to, when you make your frame, you never want it right up against the stone. So you're gonna come up and you're gonna leave a space here because this is where the chain's gonna go through. So it cannot be right up against the tip. And you're gonna come around and you wanna leave some space because as you wrap wires around this frame, what's going to happen is it's going to fill in a little bit of that space, and if your frame wire is directly up against this stone, you're no longer going to be able to press it down in there, and we're actually going to create kind of a little seat for it, so it needs to have room to fit in there. So we're going to do the same thing over here, giving ourselves a little bit of room, and bring this down on this side again. Stay slightly off of that. Now, if we slide our stones out of here, we're just going to connect these two, the straight line, a curve, it really doesn't matter. And where these guys come together, we'll end up tying them together with wire and then bringing our frame down. Now, depending on how much room I have between these and this guy, I will either make like a small loop to end it off, or I will actually take this wire and loop it around this frame wire underneath it. So we're going to take a look at that before we completely finish off the frame. And I'm just going to take my 16 gauge wire and I'm going to leave a little bit of room there so that I can either create that loop or the loop around. They both use about the same amount of wire, so you're going to follow that. And then take your pliers, and where your bend is, you're going to want to bend this out. And we're just going to slowly kind of follow this pattern around. So where I'm holding this, then I'm going to bring this guy around. And I use a dead soft 16 gauge, but it can still be a little bit hard to kind of work with here to get exactly what you want, especially when you're like me and you're working off the spool, so you have this end that you have to figure out what to do with. But I'm gonna kind of straight cock these, and then I'm actually going to bend the paper around to make this easier for me to access, and that's one of the reasons why I like to do this instead of using the stones, is so that I have the ability to easily move this pattern around without all the stones flying everywhere and getting out of shape repeatedly. So we're going to create a straight line here, and the same thing, we're going to create our bend with our pliers. At this point, we're coming this way again. And as we hit here, we want to make our bend so that these two are just barely kissing. So you want them to just barely touch, and I will usually go in and kind of tighten this so that it's a nice point. And there you go. That'll give you your basic frame. And you can go ahead and cut your wire off of the spool now so that it's easier to work with. At this point, we can move our piece of paper out of the way and work just with our frame. And I like to kind of lay it down right after I've created it and place my stones into it to make sure that I've gotten a good fit here, that these tips are still leaving some space over here in order for us to create where the chain's going to go through, and that I have enough room here still for my center stone to sit within this. And I've got this all kind of laid out, and again, remember, you don't want this to be directly up against here, because if it is, this is going to be a problem. So you can see how mine has a little bit of room, and you can kind of put them in, and you want to make sure, again, with these ones that have the kind of loops on them. You can see where these are now sitting directly up against this wire, but that if I flip them over, it's creating this weird gap. So you want to make sure as you're setting them in that you're setting your stones in the proper direction if they have that little bit of lilt like I have, so that they're setting directly in there. And then a lot of times I'll go ahead and leave my stones sitting in the proper direction above me so that I know how I'm going to pick them up and move them down into the pendant when it's ready. So knowing that this is ready and knowing that this is a very skinny stone and that these are fitting very closely up against it, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take these and I'm going to tie this top part right here together, and then I'm going to bring these wires right here around the bottom of this frame, and that's going to tie our frame together and complete it. So I'm going to take a small amount of 20 gauge half round and I'm going to put it on here, and I'm going to tie this guy together. And I always forget to check which side of the half round is the flat side before I start using it. Don't do that. You want the flat side against the wire for a tighter fit and the rounded side outward. And you just want to go through and tuck those in. If you need to tie it off, you can then kind of loop it up and around, and then loop it around one of these frame wires once or twice so that it has a tighter area to tie off to. And smooth it down. And the same thing for down here. If you want to tie it off, just bring it around a single wire right here. And you're going to tie it. And so if I get this up near, and we flip it around, you can see the other side. And from here, what we're going to do is we're going to take these ends, and we're just going to bring them around here and tighten them up against this. Now I'm going to cut it with my flush cutters, and I have special flush cutters for working with my 16 gauge frame wires because they will destroy. I don't know if it will focus on there, and you can see the chips and stuff that this thicker wire puts on my flush cutters. So I have an older pair that got too beat up to work with the delicate wire, and I have saved it for my frame wires, and that is all I use it for. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this side onto there as well. I'm gonna trim this off. And there we go. Once you lay this down, again, you can lay your stones in, kind of check your fit, and you can decide in this case if you want it to sit with this here, or if you want to bring this way where you're bringing this wire up higher. Now, in my case, I'm going to go back in and smooth this down a little bit more. But I think I'm going to go ahead and use it in this direction. So I'll lift it up so you can see where the wires are coming over the front instead of around the back. And then once you're ready to start building your pendant off of your frame, the first thing that you're gonna do is you're going to go in and kind of pinch this until you've got just a little bit of clearance, but not too much, So you want to leave yourself just the smallest distance between here and here, and the same thing on the other side. And this is usually just pinching this a little bit. And once you've got a good idea of those distances and you're happy, I'm going to set my stones back down in the position that they are within the pendant, and I'm going to take some more of my half round. Now, checking which side is the flat side first, I'm going to wrap it several times around the top frame wire, and you want it to be behind your pendant based on whichever side you decided was the front. So since I decided that this is the front of my pendant, I have the wire wrapping behind it. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come a little ways down, and I'm just going to create, and I need to use not my terribly beat up flush cutters here. I'm just going to create a nice little shelf right here for that piece of stone to sit on. And in this case, I'm just wrapping it 3 or 4 times around. You want to pull it kind of taut, but not so tight that it's warping your frame, because if you pull it too tight, it will pull those 2 wires tighter together, and you will cause issues where your stone does not fit. If that happens, you can take this entire piece at this point, because it's not tied into anything, and you can slide it up or down to the place where it fits best in position. And then you can place your stone into here, and you'll see, as I was saying, like, you need that space between them for this wire to sit. And so you've got your stone sitting in, and this wire is just going to keep it from falling through. We're going to do the same thing right in here, and I'm going to wrap here and then run across and then wrap down so that I'm keeping it from being able to slide any more into the inside of the pendant, because these loops are going to block it. So we're just going to loop this guy around. And I've overlapped my wire a little bit, so I'm going to smooth it out with my pliers. And again, you want to make sure that you're on the back of the pendant, same as the other one. And you're going to slide that in, and you can see how these loops are going to keep it from pushing any further into the pendant. And then you're going to come across, and I'm just going to cut this off at this point. And then wrap this for however much wire I just cut off. Alright, so now that it's done, you want to push that down against this other wire. And this is giving you a small shelf, and this stone will sit on it. Now, if you flip it over, the stone is going to fall right out. Alright, so we don't want to leave it sitting there. We're just creating this shelf right now. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and start creating the shelf on the other side. And then I will show you how I use the wires on the top to actually tie the piece down to that shelf. So let me get a couple more pieces of half round, and we're going to create the shelf on the other side exactly the same way. And if you want, what you can do is you can go in here and you can count exactly the number of loops because sometimes these loops will be visible from like the side of the pendant, and it's nice if you're building a symmetrical pendant if you have exactly the same number here as you do on this side so that they look the same. So from here, what we're gonna do is we're going to get some 20 gauge round, and we're going to get some 20 gauge half round, and I'm going to wrap the half round around the round, and that is going to create this right here, which I use along the top of the stone on either side and around the bottom, and it basically is going to create like a wall to help us hold this stone in. And this guy, when we put it on there, we're going to use it so that these guys can't slide back and forth, and that's going to be the first part of holding it in, is keeping them right here within. What we first need is a piece of 20 gauge that will run around the bottom up here, and same on the other side, with just enough left over that it can create loops around the edge and tie itself off. So that's this, and I usually take my half round here when I'm doing this, and I will use a drill to connect it. Sorry, my wires are all tangled right now. So I will usually take it and start it on one end, and I'm going to give myself just a tiny bit on the end here because this is where we're going to tie it off. We don't want the half round around that part. And you can see here where I've left this little piece sticking off of it, and that is so that it will fit within the drill chuck. And when I slide it into the drill chuck, I'm gonna stick that little piece in between two of the chucks, and that's gonna keep that half round from turning on me while I'm using the drill. And I'm gonna kind of hold the wire, put a finger here to guide it. And I like to just barely tap it because, as you can see, my drill is facing the wrong direction. So I'll barely tap it and kind of make sure, adjust if I need to. And then if you have a adjustable speed drill, you can just kind of barely pull your trigger. If you don't, and I'm using one that's really cheap and non-adjustable right now, so you'll see I'm pulsing the trigger down here. And it just keeps it from building up speed. And once you kind of get to a point where you feel everything's working, you can speed it up if you want to. You just want to make sure you keep control of that drill. And then when I'm done, I go ahead and I snip this off with my flesh cutters and just smooth off these last little bits of wire with my pliers by pinching them down. And that's going to give us our piece of wire. Now I'm going to take that piece of wire and I'm going to start it on one end here. I'm going to remove the other stone for a second so it does not fall out. And I want to kind of create this a little bit of a nip here. And from there, we're going to wrap it around the frame wire. And you'll see how it's now running ever so slightly over the tip of that stone. And we're just going to take it and kind of nestle it into that space between the stone and the frame wire in here. We're going to kind of nestle that right on in there. And right now we're just laying it in there. We'll tie it down later. We're going to bring this around. I'm going to set the other stone in over here and do the same. Okay, so before I tie this off, I'm looking at the bottom here, and this is getting pushed upward really far by the wires from the frame where they're tied off. So I can either take this wire and tuck it underneath them and then have it come back out, or I can bend it downward a little bit here and just kind of bring it underneath it here so that it does a little bit. Oops. And don't manhandle it like I just did. Just a little bit of a kick under that. Let's see how that goes. And then we're gonna slide these on here really quick to test how I like the look of that. And this still runs the length of that, and then do keep in mind that we're going to be mounting this over top of that. So since this stone is going to lay over top of it, I actually kind of like that dip downward, so I'm gonna go with that. I'm gonna set these stones back out again. We're gonna bring this through here to tighten it up. So that's going to give us our little bits. And you'll see how this side is a little bit closer to the edge than the other side. So I'm going to kind of slide it until I have these even. And then that's going to require just the tiniest bit of adjustment of where my downward doo-woppies are. These very technical terms like doo-woppy and thingamajig. There we go. And I spend a lot of my time when I'm wire wrapping just kind of nudging things around with my fingers until they're exactly where I want them. And if we lay this guy right here, you'll see that we're starting to get a wrap around these stones. So we're going to bring another one. We don't want to tie this down yet because we need to be able to get underneath it, because we're going to bring another one underneath it, around the top, and underneath it over here. And once we do that, these stones will be in a situation where this side is completely held down, and then mounting this guy over top of them is going to basically lock them into place. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create another one of those half round wires and then run it along the top here. I'm just going to slide this guy under. And for now, I'm just looping that. I didn't fully connect it. I'm just looping it so that I can get an idea of fit and everything like that without fully committing. It's call it a fear of commitment. I want to make sure that everything is right before I completely tie this guy down. And these ones usually require a little bit of a kind of a kick downward at the end. And I'm going to tuck this guy under as well. And you see that's another good reason, because I'm sliding it out of the way there. And then bringing this guy under. I'm going to pull this guy back into place. Pull this guy over here. Ooh. And again, don't push too hard or you'll keep doing what I'm doing and manhandling the wire, and we don't want to do that. We're going to bring this slightly over. And one thing that you will see is that once again, I am just slightly over where I need to be with my half round, but it's not a huge amount. It's not something that I'm going to reuse. So I will just go into this guy and peel a couple of pieces of half round back to get to exactly where I want to be. And with the copper, I'm usually just kind of letting it fly off onto the bench somewhere and cleaning it up later. When it's silver, I will clip it, and I have a small container that I keep all my silver scraps in so that I can trade them back in later. So that is going to give us kind of our walls on the top and the bottom. And we're ready to start tying these down. And you'll see how this is going to start filling in those spaces and creating more area that holds this guy in. And once again, when we bring this carnelian in and we mount it over top of everything, it's going to overlap just enough that it's going to be the piece that holds all of this together. So I'm going to slide the stones out again, and you actually have to you cannot just lift them out because of this now. You have to lift them and pull them outward. So I'm going to slide those out, and then I'm going to go in here and I'm going to tie these down. So there we go, and we've gone ahead and set this up right here. And we want to slide it down a little bit. You want to make sure that you have enough room in here that that wire or chain or whatever you put it on afterwards is going to be able to slide in there. because if you can't get it on a necklace, there's really no point. And then we're going to come around to the other side and do the same thing. And again, I'm looking at this and I think I'm going to pull just the tiniest bit of half round off of this side as well. And this piece, if you notice that the edges are kind of chewed up, this is a piece that I had originally made for something else and did not end up using. So anytime that I make a piece, like some half round around the 20 gauge or something like that, and I don't use it, I just stick it in a box and I save it, and then eventually I will come up with something that is the same size as what I need. I have a giant box of coiled coils, for instance, where sometimes I just get bored and make coils if I can't think of anything else to make, and then later I will just fill them in as I run into coils of the size needed. So I'm going to go ahead and trim this off. And one of the last things that I do at the end of everything is I'm going to go through all these ends and clean them off. We're going to use a file and some clippers and everything to just make sure that there's nothing back there that's going to be scratchy and causing issues for anybody who's wearing the pendant. So this is where your frame ends up after these two pieces, and it's still not quite looking like a lot, but if you take and you compare it here to the fully finished piece, you can actually start to see the similarities here, where we have our bail section, where it has the wires that run underneath, where we're going to run wires or beads or something down the center to hold this inner part of the stone. And then from there, we'll go ahead and we'll start adding some embellishments, and those are what's really going to detail out the pendant and hold it together. So I'm now going to slide my stones in here and set them down. And you want to make sure you're putting them in the right direction and that they fit in there. Because at this point, I'm getting ready to start tying them down, and I'm gonna adjust this wire a little bit because it's pushing them around and kind of shoving them upward. And I'm just kind of pinching everything into place until it sits well. So there we have a little bit of our base, and we're going to take and start adding a couple of wires and really tying this thing together so that it's going to start becoming a cohesive whole, and you can stop worrying about the wires falling off of it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take some 28 gauge weaving wire, and just down here where we've made our little hoopy-doo, again a very technical term, I'm going to tie this wire down and hold the half round wire to the frame. And when I tie half round wrapped wire to things, I like to get right in between the ridges where the half round ends, because it creates a really nice look having that weaving wire inside of there. It kind of creates almost like an accent, even though this is a wire that you have to hold the piece together. It looks decorative at this point. You just want to take your time, kind of go through one at a time. If this is getting in the way, you can pull the stones out. I like to hold them in place at this point if they're not doing what this one is, just to kind of know where I'm tying things and know that at this point, wherever I'm putting it is going to leave room for the stones to fit properly. Because if you tie it down really tight and you didn't have the stones in place and you tied it into where the stones are going to sit to where they can't sit properly, then you have to take everything off and do it over again. And then when I'm done with that, I'm just going to leave this piece of weaving wire down there because we will use it again to tie down other things. And at this point, you'll start to see I can kind of hold this up and jiggle it, and the stones are starting to be held in place. They're not falling out. Now, I wouldn't wave it around or get too crazy with it, but it is starting to hold together at this point. And I'm gonna set that down now, and I'm gonna take this guy and I'm going to create a piece to hold this guy on. And I do that in any number of ways, but with the long, thin guys like this, I like to kind of create almost a fake bezel in a way. So I'm gonna take some 20 gauge and I'm gonna wrap it around the stone, trying to start in the middle. So we have a piece that this stone will fit into. And now what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this piece also in our half round. And then we will put another piece over top of it. And when you finish, you kind of tie them together and it will hold the stone in place. But what we're going to do is we will then slide this guy back where he belongs. Guys, I work over a pad because I drop stones a lot, you'll notice. We're gonna mount this in and we're gonna bring these ends over and around the back. And these are going to create that third bail on the back of the pendant that you run the chain through to keep it from cutting across the top. So this gives us kind of an idea of exactly how much half round we need. And usually when I'm working with smaller parts like this, I won't use a drill. I'll just go in and I will wrap it by hand. And I usually just kind of start in the middle, get it going. And then once it's kind of started up, I will slide it to the edge of whatever part of the wire I need it on. And then from there I can just kind of hand turn it so that I can be a bit more precise on exactly where I want it to end. Now you can also, if it's easier, turn the wire to give yourself a handhold so that you can almost make a crank to do this. And this is how I did all of my half round wrapping until I got a drill. So when we get to the end here, I am not going to cut this off of the spool of half round. I'm going to go ahead and leave it on the spool. Here we go. And the reason for that is because I'm going to use it to tie these wires together. So we're gonna kind of straighten this guy out. and wrap him around this stone. Once we get to the top here and we're wrapped around, I'm gonna go ahead and use the half round to tie these two wires together. Wrap this to create our back bail. Now I'll go in and pinch it every now and then with my pliers to straighten it out and make sure that they're flat next to each other. And you don't want to go all the way to the end because you're going to need to have a little bit of room to tie these two off. So this is going to be the first part of our setting for this stone. And then we're going to create another wire that's actually slightly smaller than this stone. One that it won't be able to push through. We're going to leave a little bit of a tail on it. And I'm going to use these guys to give me a nice rounded edge for this one. Both the top and the bottom. So once this goes over, we're going to go ahead and we're going to tie it down to itself. So I'm going to tighten this together and then I'm going to bring the ends around the back to create a backing for the stone. And I'm going to leave a little bit on each side so that I can tie this off. But you want to make sure that the stone will not pass through. And then go ahead and bring these guys over on either side. I'm just going to tuck these wires out of the way for a second around the back. So we've got our stone, we've got our piece blocking it, and then we're going to bring these wires along to the back to create a backing for this stone. And as we get to the bottom end, we're going to create 2 little loops. And I need a really tiny loop tool because this is a very long and skinny stone. I'm just looping it over top of itself, and then I'm going to go in here and snip the extra. And the same on the other side. Okay, so in order to connect this on both sides, we're going to take some 28 gauge weaving wire, and we are going to weave it around this top piece of 20 gauge, and I usually have a bit more success getting it to come through if I go through up here, and then after it's through, slide it down to where I want it at the bottom of the pendant, because the top has a small amount of gapping that the bottom does not have. So we're going to wrap that around a couple times. And then I'm going to trim this off. And I'm going to slide this between the half round wrapped 20 gauge and the stone. And this should pull tight and give you a nice little piece there. And once it's through, we're also going to pass it through the back loop. And tie this down. And I usually, after 1 or 2 times, like to go between that 20 gauge wrapped and the stone again, just to kind of hold this whole wrapped area in place where I want it. So I'll use the gaps in there to kind of set it into place. And then wrap this a couple more times. Just to tie it off. And once you have it wrapped, you just go ahead and leave the tail of weaving wire, because we're going to use that to help tie this whole piece down to the main pendant. And that's going to give us our setting. And once it's set, it will sit at the front of the pendant, just like this, and the top of it is going to curve around the back, and you'll start to see the pendant taking shape. Now, before I actually mount this down, I like to add a little bit of accent and filigree to my pieces, and that I usually do either with plain 20 gauge, round or square. And in this case, I'm going to take a couple pieces of square. I'm going to cut them just a bit longer than what they would need to be to run along here. And then I'm going to take them and straighten them out. And I usually do my wire straightening with my fingers if I can, and if for whatever reason the wire is very kinked, I will use a very beat up pair of nylon tipped pliers. Usually for this gauge, you can just straighten that right out with your fingers, and that allows you to kind of feel your way around too and make sure that it's exactly how you want it. So I'm going to lay these two wires right next to each other, and I'm going to have them run along the top of the stone here. But right here at this corner, I want to make a loop. So firstly, I'm going to take these and bend them behind this, and again, I'm not going to instantly tie them down because I don't want to fully commit. I just want to get those to where they're held in place. I want to make sure that I'm holding my wires up against each other, and as I pinch, I'm going to move that wire out of the way. I'm just going to start to create a nice little swirl where I guide these wires around right in here. And as I create that swirl, I'm going to bring it around here. And then with it sitting right on the corner of that stone there, I'm going to start one for the other side. And these little swirls will also work like prongs to help hold the pendant together. And as it comes up here, we will bring it up and along against this wrapped piece and around the back. And now, holding this where I want it to lay, you can see over here why I don't like to fully commit right away, because that swirl has ended up kind of pushing it out of the way. So I'm going to lift these back up and adjust it just a little bit to move that bend further down the wire. And that's going to give us just a little bit of design over here. And I'll take this leftover piece of weaving wire and bring it up through the center here and use it to just tie this guy down and hold him in place. And I'll wrap it around a couple times. And this does not have to be the prettiest wrap in the world, because remember, we're going to have a stone sitting directly on top of it. So mostly all we're concerned with is just that it is tight enough to hold these wires down. So here, I'm gonna take these guys, snip them with my flesh cutters, which do not like being used at the very edge, and then tuck them around and under with a thinner pair of pliers than that, so that I can really kind of control where it's going. And as your stone gets more mounted, you're working in that tiny place between the stone and the base wire in here, and it can get a little bit difficult to get in and push your wires. So having a nice small pair of pliers that you can get into those tiny places with. I have these guys right here, but in a pinch, I also have these guys, which are extremely needle-nosed and will really just slip in there. So now I'm going to come over here. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to trim this guy. Before I do this, you'll see one of the things that you'll notice is this stone still has a little bit of back and forth give here. And as we continue to wrap things here, it's going to create blocks that will stop it from sliding back and forth. So this one is already much tighter in there. That needs to be just a little bit shorter. Like I said before, a lot of what I do is just kind of pushing and nudging things into the correct place, pinching them to the correct tightness so that they're all holding each other where they're supposed to be. So now, in order to kind of match these and give one last piece of decoration that will fill these gaps in right here, and I'll move this closer to the camera so you can see there are still like a few gaps showing right there. So I'm going to run a single piece of wire through there to kind of fill those gaps. And I'm going to slide it through, create a bit of a bend. And on this one, I'm not going to, but on some of my pendants, I will put the square wire into a drill before I do this and spin it so that it gives it a nice kind of twisted look, which is a bit of a different look and feel from the kind of clean lines I'm looking for in this pendant, but you can see that in the other pendant that I've shown. So with this wire being as long as it is, I'm not going to try and shove it through and bend it all out of shape. I'm going to get it where it needs to go and estimate how much wire I'm going to need and trim it off first so that I have less distance that I need to work with. And then I will pull it further through here so that I can kind of slide it under without it becoming misshapen and getting a lot of bends in it. And then this wire will push up against that wire and bend around. And once we have that in there and ready to connect, I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of weaving wire and just tie these two pieces together and tie them to the back of the pendant. So I'll wrap this around a few times just to hold these two together. And then I'll flip it around to the back. And tuck it around the frame wire as well. And then you can take these two wires if you want and twist them together just to hold that nice and tight. Keep it from coming apart. I'll take this and bring it around and tuck it in so that it will not scratch. Now we're going to go ahead and come to these edges, tuck these around to tie them down. That's one side, and now we'll do the other. Now we have a nice base. We've got our stones in here pretty securely. I'm going to go ahead and come on over here. At this point, we'll slide these down pinch this just a little bit tighter so that that stone doesn't slide back and forth. And then the same thing over here. We're going to pinch that tighter if it needs it and make sure that those stones don't slide at all. And at this point, if you have anything like your swirls looking slightly off center, you can kind of adjust them so that they're even. You can set this on top of it just to get a good idea of where it's gonna sit and how those swirls will look. And in this case, most of the swirl is going to be hidden by the stone, but it is doing its job of holding that piece in. Now, if you want the swirls to show up, what you can do is just kind of twist that swirl along the wire and bring it further up the pendant. And you can do that on both sides. And I'm just doing that by grabbing it flat into the pliers and just kind of twisting it so that it unravels on one side and ravels on the other. You want to make sure when you do that you have a good hold of both of the wires so that they're moving simultaneously. So if we go ahead and do that and bring those further up, then when we slide this stone on here, those swirls are now visible on either side of the stone instead of being invisible. And so we're going to go ahead and take these guys and use them to stitch on to the bottom of the pendant. And this is just going to hold it on there nice and tight. Keep it from being loose and wobbly. Or for you being able to lift it up off of the top. Because we're also going to use this part right here as our back bail, and that is going to hold it together as well. For now, I'm going to lift that up out of my way. And just start tying off our ends here. And once they're through a few times, go ahead and snip them off and tuck them under. Once that's nice and tight, I'll trim that off. And then I'm going to take these guys and I'm going to create some loops over here. I like to just loop the wire on top of itself and then trim it where I want it afterwards. I feel like that gives me better loops. here, loop it over top of itself, and then trim it and flatten it down. And these don't have to be exactly matching sizes or anything. But we're going to create a bump here. And you don't want that bump to be too high of a bump, because remember, this is going to be laying flat on their back. So you don't want it to be too terribly high up. In this case, I'm going to do it just slightly like this. And then with that and the dip between the stones, they'll be able to slide it in and around. And I'm going to bend this just slightly that way so that it slides in onto this flat area. This part is always, it kind of depends on the pendant where you find to attach this. But in this case, this seems like a nice place to kind of tie it down. Get it in there, connected to the frame. Sometimes if I'm having a problem completely tying something down because I can't get a wire through, I'll just go ahead and go through a whole nother part of the pendant if I have to, and then pass it back through that part of the pendant. And then we're going to go ahead and tie this off right here. Now this, you can kind of do as much or as little tying down as you feel like your piece needs to be secure. So if your piece feels like after, 6 or 7 times around it's nice and secure, then you don't have to keep going and wrap the entire thing in knots. But if you've done, just a couple of times and it's still feeling wobbly and you don't feel like it's holding on well, then you can just go ahead and add a couple more. If there's not enough wire on the ends that you've saved, then go ahead and add another piece of wire in there. This is really all about just adding those finishing touches until your piece feels as though it has been secured. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to get in here. As you can see, this is a little bit wobbly at the top right here. And I'm going to get in here and I'm going to stitch this guy right here to the back of the pendant just to hold it in place so that this guy will not move back and forth. And that'll be done just by running the piece over this way. And then through here. I'm going to be on the other side of that. And I'm not getting that to tuck in as tight as I want it to, and I'm afraid if I pull it, it's gonna break, so I'm gonna go through here again. because I want this to go through very close to the actual inner part here. And while I can get it to go in there, I'm not able to get it to come back through. So what I'm gonna do instead is actually use this wire. I'm going to kind of just lift it ever so slightly up with my finger and see if I can't slide it through there. And this is really about just finding a place that we can get a purchase, that we can pull this wire down tight, and we're not going to have this visible in the top. Since I don't seem to be able to do it this high up, I'm actually going to move this whole piece of wire further down the pendant. And I'm going to leave this whole part in the video because this is a big part of the process, is finding those places to tie things down and stuff like that, and trying and finding out that it's not going to work, and then trying something else. So now that I'm further down into the back, if I take this and tuck it up through here now, it's going to come along the back and not be just this visible wire that does not belong. And then the same thing over here. We're going to come through here, pull it tight, and these two are going to tighten up and hold this guy centered between them. You'll want to wrap it around a couple times. And if you're having a problem because your frame wire is too tight for it to get a good purchase to tie off, go ahead and turn it sideways and wrap it around this half round wire right here. And the same on the other side. Bring this around. Tuck it under here, and we're going to tie it off to this half round right here. Of the final things that I do with my pieces, once I get everything stitched down, because this sticks back slightly, in order to make everything lay together flat, works better if you take the very tips on each end and slightly bend them backwards. And this will cause it to lie flatter here, where all three pieces will create a flat purchase for the pendant, so it's not constantly wiggling back and forth. When you do that, it may actually loosen it a little bit around the stone like it has here, but that's okay, because the final thing that we do when we're finishing one of these is to go in with weaving wire and tie these guys tight down to the frame so that they will hold that stone firmly. So at this point, you can see the pendant, you can see the shape that it's taken, you can see the design, you can really tell what it's going to look like when it's done. And all that we're really looking for now is to take some wire and go in a couple of places and just really make this tighter, because as you can see, this guy right here is still just a little bit loose. Now you can take this and kind of pinch against it, and that's going to tighten it somewhat because it won't be able to wiggle back and forth as much with this wire in the way. So already that's making it much better than it was. And you want to make sure that you're only pinching that back frame wire as you're doing this. You don't want to be pinching against these top wires, because you will, like I have just done, misshapen them. And then once everything is nice and tight, you can take a piece of weaving wire here and just tuck it around these guys. Hold them down nice and tight, and then also bring it around that 20 gauge in a couple of places, and you're just even one time around just to hold that down into place is really all you need here. You don't want a bunch of these or all around getting in the way of your nice clean pendant design. So this is just a single little notch that you're going to add, and you want to try and add it in the exact same spot on each side. So when you put it over here, don't put it way down here, don't put it way up here. You want to aim for about the same spot. And that's going to hold it in, and at that point you'll have no wiggle on your stones. This one still has a little wiggle because it's not tied down, but this one is nice and firm. And you'll be able to send that out to a client without worrying that that stone and that setting is not secure. I'm just going to pinch that down just a tiny bit, and I'm going to get myself a piece of weaving wire for the other side. And as much as possible, you'll notice I've been using the ends that I've trimmed off of my other weaving wire, but in this case I just didn't have any that were quite long enough that I was happy with the length, so I'm going to get a new piece off the spool. And again, sometimes when you can't get it through because it's too tight, if you start further up where there's a gap, you can then kind of wiggle it downward to where you want it. I'm going to take this and kind of look at it before I tuck it through and just make sure that I'm kind of right where I want it. And then this is going to go through, I hope. There we go. And if you've ended up wiggling it all around while you're doing this, you may have to go in again and recheck that it goes in at the place that you want it to go in at. And we're about even here. So I'm going ahead and bringing these through. Really want to grab that one. And then we're going to go ahead and take these and twist them around that frame wire a couple times to tie them off. And this can sometimes be a little bit frustrating to get them to go where you want them to. So I will usually get that little piece to come out and take my needle nose pliers, grab it, and pull. Once you're done tying it off, you have your completed pendant. In order to wear it, you go ahead and you slide through the front on one side, and then make sure to tuck it under through the middle, because otherwise when you wear it, you're going to have that line that comes straight across. So you go through the back and the middle, and then back out the front, and that's going to give you a nice pendant that just seems like it runs along that part of that cord. And that's it. I hope you're able to make some really awesome pieces with your different pairs.